going to get started. I wanted to start by thanking MPavilion for gathering us all here and making the event possible. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really nice to be able to do these sorts of things in person again. I just wanted to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Yalukit Willam Boonwurrung as the custodians of the land on which we're gathered today. The Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Yalukit Willam Boonwurrung are two of the 5 major language groups of the Greater Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their ancestors, past, present, and future. My name is Sarah Burrell. I teach into the spatial design program at Monash University, and I'm also doing a practice-based PhD through RMIT's School of Architecture and Urban Design. In my PhD research, I'm looking into using temporary urban interventions to shift perceptions of public spaces and uncover previously unseen narratives of space. So I'm approaching the topic of monuments from a real interest in how experiential and relational techniques drawn from contemporary public art and socially engaged practice have informed the creation of new contemporary monumental practices. Memorials and monuments are practices that mediate our connection to place and past events. They are these kind of narrative overlays on top of the built environment and are a part of how we construct meaning from our surroundings. But so often they also mask histories of violence and marginalization of First Nations people, and this really came to a head last year in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests, where we saw toppling of imperial and Confederate statues. And also here in Melbourne, for example, we've got the settler colonial overlay in the landscape based on where we are here right now as part of the Hoddle Grid, which is this structure that seeks to order the natural environment. And we see street names such as Burke and Swanston Street surrounding us here. So essentially, in this session, we're aiming to question some of these embedded narratives and expand on ideas of what monuments and memorials can be, looking to innovative, creative practices to provide new ways to experience place, time, and collective identity. And the panel discussion is also a companion event to a workshop that I held earlier in the afternoon, also called Minor Monuments, and in it, lovely group of people, some of who are still here. We explored the idea of counter-monuments, which is a contemporary monumental practice that is usually in 2 camps. On the one hand, they might reject and totally radically depart from traditional monumental conventions and pose new relationships to visitors to those sites, explore new materials, pay attention to the embodied experience of the visitor, and take approaches such as void instead of solid, light instead of heavy, temporary instead of permanent, or on the other hand, there are more dialogic counter-monuments that are positioned near existing, often problematic statues and seek to bring them into contact with the present and recontextualize them. So what you can see around the front of the stage are some of the amazingly inventive minor monument scale models that the workshop participants created, so I definitely encourage you to come up closer and have a look at those after the event. The concept of the minor monument is essentially a provocation to resist those erasures and overarching narratives of traditional monuments and to celebrate the minor and the everyday unseen histories of place. So I've asked each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their practice, and I've also asked them to discuss briefly a project that is counter-monumental in nature that resonates with them. So I'll hand over.
Oh, do you want to just click that one? Maybe, for these. So hi everyone, my name is Chris Cottrell. I'm the Program Director of Spatial Design at Monash University. And my creative practice works with the kind of subtle or invisible forces that tend to influence and shape the world around us, but a lot of us tend to push those neurotypically, we tend to push those things into the background, and so my practice is about sort of drawing those things into the foreground where we have to account for them and kind of make sense or work with those things that we maybe otherwise overlook. The work I chose for an example of what might be a minor monument, because I think this is a kind of a question, is a work by New Zealand artist Ash Kilmartin, and it's a neon work she did when she was in an artist in residence at Gertrude Contemporary when it used to be on Gertrude Street. The work's called On, O-H-N, and it's what she's done is replicated the only 3 lights that work on the existing building sign. So you can see in the background a sign there that says Johnson's Furniture. But the only 3 lights that work on that original were these OH and N. So she remade that work in neon, and then there was an instruction for all the artists in residence in the gallery. The last one, I think the instruction was just like, please turn the light. And it was either if you were the last one out to turn the light on, or if you were the first one in the morning that you'd turn the light off. And so the light was on when the building was empty. So it was kind of working kind of against these things, but it was also making public, the time and the work that was happening in the studios and making that kind of visible to the public, as well as kind of signaling to the history of the older kind of use of the building. And now this building is gone, and it's swanky apartments on Gertrude Street. So it also now kind of acts as this sort of thing to remember that this used to be an artist studio that's been pushed, 5 or 6, 7, 8 kilometres further out of the city. So that was my work. Shanti?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to participate in this fascinating event in this fascinating venue as well. My name is Shanti Sumartoyo. I'm Associate Professor of Design Research at Monash University in MADA, and I'm also a member of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab. My work is about how people experience and make sense of their surroundings, both in a material and an immaterial sense. And my work sort of overlaps with Chris's in that we're both interested in the notion of atmospheres and how these are part of how we make sense of the world. I've done quite a lot of work on memorials and commemorative events, particularly Anzac events. And for this, which I'll talk about in a moment, but for this small bit of homework that Sarah asked us to do, I chose Gunter Demning's Stolperstein, which many of you probably know. There are 70,000 of these small Holocaust memorials. They're peppered all over Europe and in Russia as well. He started making them in 1992 in Cologne, and they read Here Lived, so the name of the person, followed by the victim's name, their date of birth, and their fate, which is usually deportation and murder, very sadly. But they're placed in the street outside the victim's home. And I like them because there's sort of 4 things I want to say about them, I guess. The first is that they're dispersed. So they're the biggest memorial, in a sense, in that there are 70,000 of them and they're dispersed all over Europe. The second is that they are minor in the sense that they're intimate, that they're specific to the person, and that they're part of the everyday life, not just of us now, but even the everyday life of the person that they memorialize. The third thing I really like about them is how emplaced they are. So they're absolutely specific to that place, and they sort of bring you straight to that place and to that sort of moment of kind of rupture and trauma. And they're also embodied, which is the fourth thing. And by that I mean they're underfoot. As I took this photo in Brussels, and I knew about these Stolperstein, and I'd seen them also in Berlin. But I literally was looking at my feet as I was walking along, and I noticed them. So they're underfoot, but without you necessarily noticing them, although they kind of make you stumble and stop when you do. So there's a lot of, really, really sort of fascinating and, a lot to reflect on there of how he sort of did this work.
Shanti, can I just ask how big they are? How big is a foot?
They're as big as a cobblestone, so they're like
that sort of.
Like that.
Yeah,
sort
right.
of size.
So they're quite small.
Yeah,
yeah
in
nice.
bones. Yeah.
Maybe even perhaps similar in scale to the the bricks that are making up the footpath, taking on, reflecting part of
Absolutely.
that architecture.
Yeah, so they completely blend in, yeah.
My name's Stephen Roll. Hi, and I'm an artist without any sort of official affiliations. However, I teach as a sessional lecturer at VCA in the Master of Contemporary Art program, and I'm partway through a PhD at Monash, where in speaking to Kerry, who always asks me this question every time we run into each other, Steve, sum up your research question as if we're this time at a barbecue. So I said, okay, Kerry, I'll do my best, where it is concerned with Western exhibition histories, falling as part of the Western art canon, and the intersection of art and cultural practice and production by First Nations people. That's part A, and part B is how that relates to my own contemporary art practice. Speaking of which, it's not really bound in any one sort of materiality, which perhaps sort of has me thinking about the sorts of frameworks in which artworks, and also including the monument, that these framing devices that otherwise sort of designate where, when you are perhaps encountering an artwork or encountering a monument, and as part of that, of course, the narratives associated with that. What's on the screen here, I believe, is in one sense in how we sort of like hold a traditional view of monuments as bound by a physical form. It's otherwise speaking about a monument called the Monument Against Fascism, so I could say it's an artwork or a monument, and it sits across both, and I think it is really quite a an undertaking that is perhaps maybe for when it was made, and for when it has disappeared as well, that's otherwise exploring similar questions as to the idea of counter-monumentality. I just made that up, artistic license, and it was something that really resonated for me, just in terms of just this basic, I guess, action of what is otherwise somewhat of a plinth or that sort of standalone, as we commonly sort of think about and actually sort of refer to. Here we are. There's these obelisks that constitute traditional notions of the monument, where in this case it was less centred by its materiality and would sink into the ground over time, which I believe probably disappeared in terms of that original form, as indicated by the images there over a period of give or take a decade. And also privileging less the idea of a fixed narrative, where in terms of narrative it was participatory in that the members of the public responded to their own, as it could often be claimed, their own subjective thoughts and experiences and reflections upon fascism in a general sense. It's great to be here today, and I look forward to expressing further ideas about monuments when it comes back.
Sounds good. All right, thank you. It was really lovely examples that I feel like set up our discussion really well, so thank you.
Good homework.
I'm going to hand
Okay.
over to Chris to discuss his project first.
All right.
Do you need a surface?
Surface wouldn't be terrible. Oh, not for that. I can just do that.
Okay,
It's
great.
more like, so I don't remember, because my brain's not really working, I had to write some things down. So I'm going to talk about a project I did in 2015. It's called With Fluidity, and it's an audio work in Otatahi, Christchurch. that I made with another artist, Susie Pratt, and it was curated by Mel Oliver at the Physics Room Gallery, and it was presented as part of their off-site program. And maybe I should, oh, I'm right-clicking. I should left-click. There we go. Let's turn the mouse here around. So, Otatahi Christchurch was in British colonial kind of times, was founded on the banks of what they called the Avon River, or the Otakaro. And the river and the city are kind of really closely bound up in terms of their identity. Like Christchurch has, even the council logo has the city, and it has this cathedral, which we'll get to in a second, which you probably know. So it provides this kind of sense of identity and continuity for the city. And this work was in response to, I guess, the earthquakes in 2010 and 2011 that really devastated the city, particularly the central business district. And part of the reason why that destruction happened was the proximity to the river, and also the loss of traditional practices of river upkeep. So not only indigenous, but also early Dutch settlers and migrants brought with them a lot of knowledge about how to care for waterways and maintain them in such a way. And as that knowledge was lost, it actually meant that the water table sort of seeped into a lot of the central business district. And then when the earthquakes occurred, you get this effect of liquefaction, which is basically when the earth turns into like a quicksand and everything falls over, and it's quite bad. So we were trying to kind of respond to this kind of situation of how this thing that gave identity to the city also caused its undermining, and what that kind of meant, as well as the strategic plan, or maybe this kind of overarching kind of approach by the, I'm clicking the wrong button again, it was called the Christchurch City Development Unit, and then the Christchurch Earthquake Recovery Agency. They came up with a master plan, and part of their master plan was, let's make the city very rigid, and we'll divide everything into these precincts. And so they had precincts for retail, and that was over here, and then healthcare was over there, and then justice was over here, performing arts, that's down there, and you couldn't have any performing arts, intersecting with these other things. And so we were kind of really interested in how these different ways of thinking about the city might kind of come together. So we were interested in there's a lot of citizen-led action immediately after the earthquakes to kind of get things happening. And then there was this big consultation process of what people wanted. And then they're like, yeah, but we'll just put a big stadium on top of that historic building that you've worked really hard to save. So we were kind of trying to sort of tread the line between those kind of two impulses, I guess. So for a bit of visual context, this is the Christchurch Cathedral 4 years after the earthquakes. So it was probably around this time that the plan was, this kind of precinct plan was starting to be put into action, and it was probably the first time I grew up in Otatahi in Christchurch, and my parents still live there. So I'd been back kind of every year, every 9 months or so since the earthquakes. And so I had a pretty good sense of what was happening. And for, I think, 2 years, you couldn't even go into the central business district. So at this point, more was being opened up. And it felt like there were fewer buildings being demolished, because they were done very slowly and very carefully, the demolition process. And all this rubble had to be carted away. There were more buildings being built than kind of... So it was at kind of this turning point. And then I'm going to just play a little clip, if I can. Oi! Can I? Why doesn't it want to let me click ahead? All right. Is there audio? Or is there audio? I could try and Foley it, but it's kind of hard. Is the volume up on yours? Yeah. Could be the HDMI. Anyway, there's some sound. Do you want to just try in this sound setting, see if the audio out is HDMI or the other one? I can just talk over that. Well, I'll just talk in the background here. So what we were trying to do was explore like the way that this kind of idea of the river might work against this idea of a kind of top-down, precinct-oriented master plan. And so the project's title name, With Fluidity, came from this idea of a confluence, which means to flow together. And so we were interested in how do these different things kind of mix into each other, and how that might work kind of counter to this deterministic approach from the Christchurch City Development Unit. Can we go to the next slide as well, just to be tricky? But I think once you plug in the HDMI, maybe it might change. Anyway, give it a whirl. Maybe I should just go back. Yeah, let's click on the next slide and we'll see what happens. So as well as the audio walk that we were making, which we will hopefully hear parts of, otherwise it'll be a bit, well, whatever. We'll just have to imagine. We also made an artist book and a poster, which served as a kind of map and a kind of graphic representation of kind of the relationship, I guess, between the river and this kind of city grid that sometimes acknowledges, but frequently doesn't really acknowledge the path of the river. And these were made, so this was a 10-day project. So we sort of went from, we had an idea of what we were going to do, and we made a bunch of recordings, as well as designing this book and printing it with someone, Alice Bush, who was a fine arts student at Christchurch University of Canterbury. So this one also might have audio. Meow. So this is the start point of the walk. And part of the kind of quality, I guess, of what we were trying to do was leave a bit of space for people's imagination as well, to start thinking about like the city was in this in-between place of being pulled apart and put back together, and to leave them some space to think about what it was that they wanted, and things that they might have remembered, or things that were kind of changing over time, especially as some of these spaces have been cordoned off for a couple of years. A bit kind of, not dissimilar actually, just thinking what it's like to kind of rediscover Melbourne, like this last sort of 3 or 4 months. And so there was a route that followed the river, crossing kind of at various points across bridges. And we were really looking with the audio track was kind of built up of, I think, kind of 3 components. One was a series of field recordings, so recordings of the water, so that slide of the kayak with the microphones. We had recordings like that, bird song that we'd recorded in a like bush reserve at like very early o'clock in the morning. And those kind of, and then some of those were sort of lightly kind of digitally processed to kind of add to this kind of watery kind of quality. And then that served as kind of a bed for other kinds of spoken things. So one was a kind of very simple, just like take a seat on the bench, or cross at the lights, or count the stones as you da-da-da-da-da. And then there were also these other kind of little mini stories that we kind of researched and drew out from the history of the river. And so often we kind of worked with those as a way to kind of leave it kind of open to interpretation and leave quite a lot of space for kind of ambiguity or imagination. So rather than saying, this river was named by such and they called it this after blah, 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 I think there was a little fragment of text that just said, this river was named after, this river was given the name of someone's grandfather, the river that flowed through someone's grandfather's land. But it was a bit punchier and catchier than that, because we actually spent some time drafting it. And then there were things like, this was a place where horses stopped to drink, and we just had a recording of a horse just kind of going, which was a really fun trip. So you just had these little kind of touches that sort of blended historical stories and things along with this kind of ambiguity or openness as well. And those then also mixed in the kind of in the walk with the sounds that were happening in the city as well. So this kind of mode of an audio walk is a kind of artwork or a type of artwork that Janet Cardiff, who's a Canadian artist, is probably most well known for making. And they were sort of binaural, so you can hear, and we did the same sort of thing where you're working with both channels of the stereo field. But then you can also obviously hear things through your headphones. So there was a part where you have to cross tram tracks. And sometimes we would have a sound of a tram coming, but you do sort of do this double take of whether that's the tram that's actually happening or a tram that we should be thinking about, or in some cases where there was a tram line that was no longer in use, you'd still hear this kind of tram coming over the top. So we were kind of interested as well, like I was sort of saying before, is this idea of working, rather than this top-down deterministic plan, we were really kind of, getting on the river and touching it, feeling it, walking the same route over and over again, like probably 20 times, 5 or 6 times a day that's more than, a lot. So we really got to know this, and then we were combining that with other bits of research we were doing as well. There's an idea that the Australian theorist Paul Carter talks about, where he talks about this idea of minor planning, and he talks about that as an approach to placemaking, where you think differently about your responsibilities as a designer or as an artist or as a planner, and that you really embrace kind of complexification and turbulence of human communication to shape public space. And I thought that was a piece of writing we found after the project, but it really sat quite neatly alongside the kind of thinking process we had. And in fact, in a really nice kind of coincidence or merging of, or confluence maybe, of ideas, Paul Carter goes on to talk about how the behavior of flowing water, its aesthetic appeal and its human associations communicate the idea of thinking and acting fluidly or going with the flow, and that the intelligence of water is recommended as a model of improved social awareness and interrelatedness. So I think we found that really kind of lovely as a kind of resonance to what it was that we were doing as well. And so these are just some other little spots along the walk. This is a part where there's a little bit of audio that goes, the river splits into several streams, and then mine and Susie's voices go into the left and right channels. And then we read through this. The Otakaro River has multiple other names as it flows and as things flow into it. So we sort of talk through all these different things, and there's this kind of out of sync thing that happens as well. I wonder if it's just me clicking that's making it bad. And then this is kind of towards the end of the walk, walking through towards the bridge in the background. There is the Bridge of Remembrance, which is a war memorial for, I think, the Anzac situation, but usually is, yeah. Well, there's other wars, there's a lot of those, but yeah, it's a war memorial. But then across the other side of the river, there was a whole lot of changes happening to the kind of shopping and retail precincts. And I was just going to finish with, so this was that, let's not do that. So that was that photo from a couple of things ago, but that's just a year later. So instead of all those cranes that were in the background now, there's this kind of landscaping with these kind of terrace seatings that comes down, and then a kind of entertainment, kind of hospitality precinct on the other side. And then this was at that same time, so that's the bench I think about 18 months after we did the project, and the bench that's the starting point of the walk, you couldn't get to. So I tried to redo the walk, and there were all these little kind of obstacles and things. So for me, that's kind of interesting to think about what this artwork kind of has as its kind of place in the city. I mean, it's an audio piece that you can download or stream. It's on the Physics Room Gallery website. And you can then follow those instructions and have this experience, but some of the things that we point to or look at or draw attention to might not be there anymore, and I think that's kind of interesting as well, that there is this kind of openness and kind of imaginative space or kind of recording of, like, I guess these layers of time, that we're sort of touching on things that had happened in the past and how they are layered onto what we're seeing now, both kind of experientially and emotionally, but maybe also in terms of personal memory, or other memories that people might have of the city, and then how this work then becomes a kind of marker in time as well, of like, well, when the city was configured like this, this was the kind of experience, or these were the sorts of spaces that you kind of moved through. So yeah, for the time being, I think of it as kind of a project that's kind of sitting there, kind of latent, and as a kind of, a marker of this moment in time of where the city kind of was and where it might have gone had things maybe flowed in a different direction, or this idea that it's kind of constantly changing and not able to be controlled, which I think obviously was something that the earthquake really, made abundantly clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. It's really lovely to hear about your work, and also to see those photographs of Christchurch and how it's still changing.
Yeah, well, those photos are 5 years old-ish now.
Yeah.
So the last time I was back was end of 2019, but it was a very whistle-stop tour. So,
Yeah.
and it's been, for some reason, I haven't been back for like 18 months.
Yeah,
It's weird.
that is weird.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what it's like next time I'm back as well.
Yeah, thanks. So Sarah asked us all to draw an example from our practice, and as I don't really have a practice, I decided instead to talk about some concepts and some work that I've been developing over the past, actually for a long time, maybe the past 5 or 6 years, that I've finally got to publish last year, called New Geographies of Commemoration. And so in this work, what I've done is try to reframe or reconceptualize commemorative events and commemorative sites in a way that I think is more productive of how they actually are experienced by people and sort of how they work on us, I guess. So usually we think about commemoration and memorials as having a really strong discursive element, right? Like they're about stories. They're about, they're empowered by the stories, the tropes, the historical narratives that they recall. They're meant to tell us something about the past, something that the people that erected the memorials or laid out the contours of the ritual, the commemorative ritual, wanted us to remember. Stories that they materialize, I suppose. These stories are often intended not just to communicate something important about the past, but to create a sense of futurity, right? To create a sense of something that carries forward. Through the material form of the memorial, which is often built out of materials that are meant to last, which is why, like, your counter-memorial example is so interesting. But also through the kind of repeated ritual of commemorative events, where we're given the same stories over and over again. They're reapplied to kind of contemporary events. And we see this, for example, in the Anzac narrative, in Anzac Day and the dawn service, and these sorts of repeated tropes that are reinforced, their meaning accumulates over time. But what I've been sort of researching and then sort of arguing in this conceptual work is that instead of focusing on memorials and commemorations' discursive qualities, its narrative qualities, instead we need to reframe it through an experiential lens. So instead we need to think about how we experience these events, and I extend this to how we experience bodily the sort of material forms of memorials, how we come at them through our senses, through our feelings as moments of collective experience, and how it's this kind of affective and sort of atmospheric experience of memorials that really can tell us why they continue to have such traction. And I'll admit, I mean, the reason I started doing this work is because I didn't grow up in Australia, but I've lived here for more than 20 years, and I've never really understood the hold that Anzac has on a lot of people, not on everybody, but on a lot of people, and it certainly has a hold on the kind of national imagination in terms of national identity. So I was sort of puzzled by this, I suppose, it not being a narrative that I kind of grew up with, and I was also very curious about how it kind of aligned, or indeed didn't align, with the vastly more diverse and multicultural Australia that we live in now, as opposed to 100 years ago, and the completely unreconciled relationship with our First Nations people and with, of course, with the frontier wars. So anyway, so this is my interest in Anzac. And I was trying to get at, why is it so interesting to people? Why is it so evocative? And so this is how I got to this notion of the affective, sensory, atmospheric qualities of commemoration. So in the next slide, so there's 3 examples that I'll take you through of how I did this work and how I sort of came to this. So this is Anzac Day in 2015. So that was the 100-year anniversary, of course, of the landings at Gallipoli, 100-year anniversary of Anzac Day. And in this, so I've been to enough dawn services now, I think, over the years as I've been doing this kind of research. But here the thing that I really noticed, so I go to the dawn service, I take a lot of photographs, not in this one, but in subsequent ones. I used a GoPro camera to kind of also make a trace through the ceremony of my own movements and people's movements around me. But in this sort of bit of research, in particular, the thing I noticed was light. So in the work that I published around this, I talk a lot about light and how the changing light conditions have both a discursive quality, right, in that they draw us to the story of Anzac, to the story of the dawn kind of attack, but also how the dawn imposes a kind of bodily rhythm in how we experience it, and how there's this kind of trick of both symbolic and embodied kind of dawning of the light as you go through this sort of half an hour ceremony. So the rhythm of light, the way light is used to highlight certain symbolic elements, the way the sort of, the light rises, the way things become apparent as the light changes, and in the smaller image there, the way that now with the use of big screen, there are these kind of pools of light that collect people around them. And so you get this kind of sensory sort of visual experience of seeing people's kind of upturned faces illuminated by these big screens. So I went to light and lighting as part of my initial investigations of how kind of atmospheres work in these places. So the second image is some research I did with, thank you. Research I did with colleagues in Sweden and the UK, so Sam Merrill at Umeå in Sweden, Angharad Kloss Stevens at Swansea, and Martin Coward at Manchester University. And this was the 1-year commemorative event of the Manchester bombings, which were in 2017. So, you probably remember them, but 22 people were killed. And it was after an Ariana Grande concert, so a lot of them were young people, and certainly there was this association with sort of youth. So a year later, the 4 of us went and we spent the whole day at this kind of day-long kind of commemorative event, going with the sort of ebbs and flows of atmosphere, the different kind of official events, the sort of vernacular kind of small sort of dispersed forms of memorialization that people were engaging with. But I chose this image because I wanted to also talk about how the sort of commemorative atmospheres of an event like this travel across digital and spatial worlds, right? So it's not just that you're having a sensory or an embodied experience in that place at that time, but that's also traveling onto social media. I mean, in this case, there's a digital projection onto the side of St. Anne's Church. But the way this moved across social media and moved through the city and across the country and around the world also carried that kind of affective atmospheric experience into and across and through the digital world. So if the first piece was about light, then this for me is about what we then started to call the more or less digital world. And so the more or less kind of digital flows of commemorative feeling. And so the third slide was also in 2018. It was a big year for commemoration. And this was 2018 was the end of the First World War centennial period, the 1418 period. And I led a project that looked at commemorative events on the 11th of November in 10 different countries around the world, mostly in Europe, but also in the US and the UK, and Australia, New Zealand. And what I wrote about for that paper was this piece of work by Kirsten Hayden, Neil Haslam, and Elizabeth Terrell, which was called Flowers of War. And it's an enamel piece. So there's this big sort of Meccano-like frame, and then these individual sort of floral emblems of the different countries that participated, I think only on the Allied side, that participated in the First World War, overlaid with archival images of text and of photographs. The piece toured also to the UK, to Bristol, I think, and to Christchurch. I think it was Christchurch in New Zealand, and then ended up in the Shrine of Remembrance and was there on the 11th of November, so Remembrance Day, in 2018. So I guess what I wanted to say about this is that in this work, what I did was I interviewed people right after they'd come out of looking at this work, sort of engaging with this work. And so what I found again is that, sure, like the discursive elements were there and people were talking about, what was depicted, what was symbolized by the wreath, but they were also linking it back to things like how the accumulated forms of the floral emblems for them kind of stood in for the accumulated bodies of people that had died. Or they were fascinated by the mechanical nature of the Meccano frame, so because it sort of reminded them of the mechanics of war. So we're getting this like really fascinating mixing of the material, the immaterial, right, like how people felt, even the way the work was lit in the room. It's 2 meters big in diameter, so it's quite a big piece of work. And so, you engage with it in a particular kind of sort of bodily way. You sort of stand back and then you look at it. So together, these are sort of 3 examples of sort of how I did this work, but they showed different aspects of what I called the new geographies of commemoration that are all about the body, the senses, our feelings, and that help us see why these events and these structures, these kind of material objects continue to hold such weight for people and continue to be important. It's not just because of the story, it's a whole lot of other things are going on as well.
Okay. I'm talking about an artwork, to use probably the broadest term, of 2016 that I made as part of my participation in the City of Melbourne Biennial Lab, which, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. In having the opportunity, I'm acknowledging that it was part of this lab where it afforded me access to material resources and I guess a particular access into a site where for this inaugural biennial lab was bound by what we refer to as the Queen Victoria Market. No 2 blocks from here, over in that direction. And I won't talk about the lab too much, but perhaps it could be useful in introducing the context of my response to that site, where, in a way, I guess with the City of Melbourne as a municipality being very much centred by where we are now. The sort of, we hope, forward-thinking, progressive, experimental, supportive of the arts institution that it is, that it was in some ways experimenting with new modes and experimental modes of what we might call also broadly public art. And it was otherwise somewhat bound by the idea of not only, I guess, challenging notions of what public art often is, where in terms of traditional notions of the monument, it's something that we plonk somewhere, or plonk art as it's referred to as well, in that, I guess, why not make this a double-headed intervention that for the council, it was in response to place which was undergoing a transformation. Or I could maybe say proposed transformation, because maybe similar to, particular associations, romantic associations that we have with place, and I think that resonates with ideas of how some people might have a very particular way of engaging and thinking about Anzac Day. Similarly, that whilst people who are held to those positionalities are otherwise citing a long history with site, that like many of my co-participants who participated in this lab, through what was maybe like an intense form of investigation and intervention into that space and into that site, that we all came up with our own unique responses to place that most people know was the Queen Victoria Market. This diagram here is probably not legible from your distance, approximately 15 metres away. However, you can just see that band at the bottom in the dark blue. That represents, it's a linear temporal timeline, the Queen Victoria Market. And yeah, I guess I had taken that from what could be considered, through, the officiality of a website. It's reified, this is the history of this place, but of course it's sort of not talking about a history that preceded Europeans' arrival to that place. So, just for sake of an example, for when I was pitching my response, I added the, that constant yellow band down the bottom, where to the right-hand side it's got a 216 and it's hard to read, but basically it's denoting my sort of response to that place in, for those who might know this or may not know, that basically prior to the market being established, there was a cemetery there. And, if we even sort of think about as to what denotes a cemetery, well, is it still there? Because it's also another sort of sub-narrative of site that bodies are still interred there, even including First Nation bodies as well. So that otherwise sort of set my focus in a particular way, where the cemetery, in looking at that site from a bird's eye view, has quite a distinct sort of difference in orientation to what we know as the grid, the HODL grid, which we're a part of right now, where I've often remarked in terms of doing this project that I'd be walking up Burke Street in visiting Melbourne or Birrunga or Naarm from where I grew up in Geelong, and just thinking, I think I'm going to Fitzroy because everything's orientated north, south, east, west. If you've just to make a gross generalisation and assumption that if you're brought up in a Western society, all the streets are otherwise aligned in that way. What caught my attention is that the cemetery was aligned in that manner, however the Hoddle Street grid was not. Here's just a quick diagram of, what was demarcations in the cemetery space as to the different sort of categories that decided upon where people were interred, and a more contemporary bird's eye image also showing the difference between the north-south orientation of the cemetery and the Hoddle Street grid, which, as my artwork's title sometimes does, provide some sort of insight as to its basis. So I discovered, 70 degrees east off north. And I guess I am a secret cartography nerd as well, so I really sort of enjoyed getting in through that idea of an overlay over land. I think, Sarah, there's some mention of the grid as from what I read about your work, in that it's very much a cerebral or mental sort of overlay that otherwise sort of discounts both the physical topography, but we can say historical and cultural topographies of place. This is, I guess, an early conceptual drawing that was part of the development for Gesture 70 Degrees East New Day Rising. And it otherwise sort of displays that part of the conceptual framework for what became, I guess, an artwork, an installation, a counter memorial maybe, but maybe in the least in terms of the title of the work, Gesture, that for me, I guess, it was very much based on the idea of gesture sort of holding something that isn't bound by its materiality, is perhaps in terms of thinking beyond sight, that is replicatable, either with the body or I guess in some ways is unbounded by how we might think about the gesture in a broader sense. New Day Rising, that apart from being the title of a Husker Du album, is actually referring to what I learned from my research in this project, is that cemeteries, I guess from a Western Christian perspective, were aligned north, south, east, west, in that as you lay interred in the grave, that you'd be facing east for the second coming of Christ, which for me sort of explained why there was this anomaly between the cemetery, its own grid, and the grid of the Birrarung, where conversely there was a break from the Western tradition of north, south, east, west, because in one very practical sense, aligning what we know as Flinders Street in parallel with the Birrarung just essentially aided colonisation. It was just much easier to run bodies, run incursions, etc., up all these streets. These are some photographs which sort of sit adjacent to the main installation and intervention, which I'll get to, that otherwise was just a cataloguing of the pointy end of the triangle that was formed along the top of the grid. So I think at the top left is where Elizabeth Street meets Victoria Street, and then they're all along Victoria Street. And I forgot to finish that story of walking up Burke Street thinking I was going north and like being really confused because I guess I was walking 70 degrees east. But, you know, as people who have lived here long enough, you get used to it. So working with the bureaucracies of the Queen Victoria Market, no, not the City of Melbourne. Thank you for putting on this event and supporting M Pavilion. Thank you. Queen Victoria Market has had its own sort of restrictions with regards to material incursions. It is really a site of commerce, along with being a site for many things, and I do really acknowledge how a lot of the resistance to its development is about ideas of community and identity and how it is otherwise, despite having a commercial underpinning, a place of where people and community will gather. Anyway, I sort of basically came to this place which didn't have a designated commercial purpose, and it's actually just a thoroughfare right next to the car park, otherwise known as M Shed. Commonly, I guess in terms of my practice more broadly, I do tend to incorporate found objects. So in a way, it's like a large found object. I'll quickly read what is the statement for the work. So various interventions and gestures contribute to a narrative of place where authorship both expands and narrative is sometimes disrupted. Intervening in the physicality of M Shed responds to the site of the Queen Victoria Market via co-opting the grid, a device in the demarcation of open parentheses, cemetery, close parentheses, space, and colonial tool in the making of Melbourne. Orientating the east-west grid of the market itself, here a mark of colonial Christian perspective, because we want to see Christ as they rise, to that of the land, so it's shifting it back to a perspective that isn't bound by a Euro-Christian perspective. I'm proposing activates the site in a manner that acknowledges a deeper history and also those denied customary practice and culture. So I'm speaking about those who are displaced, both from, I guess otherwise simply turning it into a cemetery, but of course the displacement that happened and maybe somewhat, continues to happen by First Nations people here. And I go on to finish, this figurative gesture manifests in the physicality of sight, the activation occurring through light, shadow, and the perpetual rhythms of nature. So I was also sort of interested in, well, perhaps besides all these material things and bodies coming and going into the ground and coming out of the ground and so forth, that there's this perpetual rhythm of nature that otherwise continues on regardless. This is a 3D rendering of the intervention that I sort of used basically to show the activation of the space, and it occurs in two ways. It occurs through extending the parallel lines that otherwise work in a manner that we're all mostly accustomed to, which is the zebra crossing into the space. So it was basically, I guess, appropriating the markings of the space and bringing them in there, continuing them up the wall as well, and then mimicking their, thickness and position as a row of mirrors in the roof, where in terms of how light is concerned and the rhythms of the sun rising and falling each day, new day rising, is that those mirrors in the roof cast shadows down onto the lines on the ground. And I guess in some ways, in terms of memorialisation perhaps, and the monument and that sort of thing, in one sense, given it is a ephemeral work, that it did last, thankfully for me, a bit longer than some of the other works that were installed there, just given it worked okay for the Queen Victoria Market. That it allowed people to engage, where in terms of the manner of activation in how this worked, which I sort of forgot and just skipped over, is that by entering the space and looking into the mirrors, you see a four-sided shape, commonly, I guess, a diamond, which otherwise is oft used design and semiotic of Southeast Australian First Nations people, which otherwise, in its part materiality and part sort of, connection to ideas of, the perpetual, even though, I do concede the sun hasn't existed forever and probably won't, in that, it is sort of removing or shifting the site beyond its dominant narrative, where in the least it's a place of commerce and a cemetery. So when it came to bear, that's what it looked like. And I guess the other way it was sort of activated by the sun itself was when the shadows were cast, that those same diamond shapes would fall upon the marks on the ground. I I do sort of wonder in terms of visiting the night market posts its official sort of, release from me as a work, and just to sort of exist, that people were just eating their overpriced food in that section. They had set up tables, and so it was sort of nice to be this sort of secret investigator as to wonder how, if any, sort of, I don't know, pathos, or what is the capital that this had maybe generated, what had it maybe shifted, and maybe through that there's larger ideas as to, why do we do what we do? But I guess for me, and maybe in speaking for the conversations that are happening today, it is somewhat a little bit propositional, in that we're working against or in response to dominant modes of the monument. It's just another image. And perhaps in terms of, I think this is the last slide. It's pretty daggy music, so I'm glad the audio's not working. But given we had the chance, and some friends of mine, also artists, we I guess did a performance in the space, and this was a instructional video that I made to sort of choreograph a movement in the space, which in a way was trying to sort of mimic the function of the work itself, where probably at one of its most basic levels was around the use of parallel lines and intersections. This is a world premiere of this riveting piece of video, so let's not soak it up. We essentially went through what really was sort of somewhat of a ritual, in that there is the idea of a gesture in the work itself beyond the bodies, but also including the bodies of the public who would enter the space. And I guess it's sort of like, what are those shiny things? People like shiny things, hence the mirrors. But otherwise, this was perhaps a more formal and also propositional sort of set of gestures where, for the performance that happened, I think it's on the next slide and final slide. No, that's the final slide, where we carried out that performance, and we actually wore, in terms of how we adorn ourselves and have, I guess, clothing as part of our own semiotics in how we might sort of consciously or otherwise flag who we are, and how we're maybe meant to interact. It was good fun, sort of wearing a lot of the clothing that we found at the market as part of what denotes what are we cladding ourselves with.
I might start the questions by asking Steve. I was just wondering, because I guess one of the conventions of traditional monuments is that they're didactic and they instruct. And how important was it to you with your work that you got reactions from members of the public, or that they sort of understood your intervention into this space? Did you have many conversations with people, or how did that sort of shift their perception of the site?
Honestly, it wasn't really important.
Yeah.
Part of me wonders about how much weight that should hold as part of broadly a practice, but also a process as well. I've got a resistance to, I guess, didacticism, unless it's sort of maybe subverting itself through the use of text commonly. And I guess there was, at least in terms of witnessing people responding to this break in what was otherwise a consistent architectural form throughout the space that was in terms of maybe, how what we do translates to cultural capital. That was maybe evidence of that. But otherwise, I think there was a didactic text nearby.
But for you, it was more about the disruption of the structure and the co-opting of the grid and that sort of departure from it. And I think there was a nice kind of open-endedness to it and a sense of kind of interpretation. And I think in Chris's project with Fluidity, there's also a really nice sense of indeterminacy and leaving room for people to approach the work instead of being kind of instructed to. Is there anything you wanted to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of a bit of a challenge because at one hand we had to guide people through the city in a particular way and at a particular pace. And one of the problems actually, so there were these kind of things like, crossover at the lights. So there was this quite kind of do this now didacticism around like to experience the work in the way it's intended. And some people got really stressed out about doing it properly, and other people did. But the other side of the kind of text pieces were these much more open, stories of like, there's an outline of a building, a ghost building, something, or you used to be able to see the cathedrals from here, or whatever it was. There were these kinds of things that would hopefully just trigger a kind of a question or a memory or get people to shoot off and kind of, a lot of it, I think, was about asking the people who lived in the city to imagine or remember what the city was, experience how it is, and think about how it was going to be in the future in a kind of individual, personal level rather than this kind of, bam, here comes the stadium kind of thing. Yeah.
I guess that feeds in a little bit to my next question, because I noticed there was a bit of overlap with Shanti, your interest in technology in your research and looking at things like audio recording and video recording and the opportunities that they offer, and Chris's embracing of the audio walk medium. And I guess I was wondering if you guys could comment a bit on what audio offers as this kind of immaterial structure or device in terms of people's embodied experience of your work or sites.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the things I really notice when I use video is less what I see and more what I hear. Because, when you use video as part of a research process, you're not sort of capturing something that happened, right? You're making a version of your experience. Like that's sort of the way I think about it. So you're kind of, you're sort of generating a trace through a particular environment, or you're generating something to think with about a particular moment in time, not capturing some sort of experience that somehow happens outside of you, right? Like that's not what I'm interested in terms of research methodologies. But what I always notice when I use video is that I can often remember what I've seen, but I don't often remember what I've heard. And it's only in working with video material and audio recordings subsequently that I can hear things that I realize, for me at least, shifted the mood or, introduced some kind of, element that I hadn't anticipated in a really sort of powerful experiential way. So, so I think that sound is, has a kind of immersive, atmospheric quality that is a really fascinating part. It's a really fascinating part of how design happens and how design works. But also, it works on our imagination in a particular way that's really relevant to memorials and to kind of commemorative work as well.
And I think for me, the other thing with the audio walk was it's really intimate because you've got these headphones on and those headphones are kind of guiding you through the city, and it's my voice and Susie's voice, but telling these kind of stories and things. But there is this very kind of it's a very kind of personal, kind of little imaginative bubble that you're being kind of guided through the city with, and then there becomes this kind of ambiguity of like, well, what's happening on the audio track? Because there are things like rustling leaves, but then I can see some leaves there. Are they making that noise? Or so you get this kind of very intimate experience, but there's also kind of slightly weird moment where you're not sure what stuff's happening inside your little world and what's happening outside. And I think that mixing was something we were really interested in as well. And yeah, like you say, the kind of imaginative opportunities that opens up. Yeah.
And it allows you to mix time and sort of cut between time in a really interesting way, which I think you really capitalized on in your project.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I also noticed a bit of crossover in terms of light and atmospheric qualities in Stephen's work, and I was just wondering if, Shanti, you had any sort of things to add or comments about his project.
Yeah, well, I'm really delighted to meet you because I've seen the work, actually, because I did a project myself at Queen Vic Market about the atmosphere of the market. And and it's a really sort of beautiful work, and I love I love its kind of rhythmic quality, and also the sort of patterning of the black and the yellow and the gray of the concrete, which all have different kind of luminous, almost luminous qualities. That kind of high-vis paint has that kind of luminous quality. So I think that that kind of rhythmic quality of the sun also, connects us to time in a different way. And so it allows you to think about other moments in time of that site, for example, that could have been, a very, very long time ago or a very long time into the future as well. So I think that light, it has a kind of an evocative emotional quality, but it can also connect us, like sound can connect us through time in really interesting ways. I'm also fascinated to hear that you weren't really that fussed what other people made of it.
Well, that's just how it turned out, I guess. Where, I was under, as we often are, when there are deadlines, under a bit of pressure to deliver something, to manifest something. And I guess for me, it's often when I am under pressure that the things that need to emerge do that. It was without that remit, the project, where they really did encourage us to think not here, but way up here. And then, of course, they're like, oh, we've got this budget and that sort of thing. So I guess that's sort of what came out of my engagement with the space within that context, which would have been probably something different 2 years earlier or 2 years later. And yeah, well, in terms of the remit of maybe the biennial lab, I'm sure there were like various outcomes in terms of that idea of capital that I referred to as to the market goers maybe having some experience, that sort of thing, is that maybe the capital of all those sorts of works there otherwise translates to what that project informed the City of Melbourne for future, or for the development of that site, or future developments, which in terms of sound and less material interventions, I do really think that that experiential mode of engagement is something that I guess I'm sort of finding myself more interested in. It's cheaper too. Yeah.
All you need is a bit of paint.
Yeah.
Well, I think we better bring the session to a close, but we will still be around if anybody wants to come up and ask questions and chat to us informally. But I wanted you all to join me in thanking Chris and Shanti and Stephen for being here this evening, and thank you yourselves for joining us.